and zoom out a little, I think both Patrick and I share a love for aviation. We
Mm-hmm.
are, all three of us, I think, are products of aviation, and we intend to preserve the magic of flying for our future generations. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing, and I think we are very well aligned on that. Now, having said that, my biggest, one of the biggest realizations I had in Davos at the World Economic Forum was when I hosted an aviation, airline and airport CEO roundtable breakfast. And guess what? The interesting conclusion from that roundtable of CEOs was next 4 to 5 years, we are going to be pursuing growth, 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 not sustainable growth, growth. And I was, I was astounded. Okay, how? So the airline said, well, organic and inorganic growth, there are opportunities to buy other smaller airlines. And these are large airline CEOs. And okay, consolidation, sure. And even airports said, it's not just about growth in numbers. We often are capacity constrained, but it's about buying airports in new regions that we don't have exposure in. It's about expanding new and very interesting routes, like on the Airbus A321 XLR, which gives airports some very interesting point-to-point destinations. So the conclusion I received was, yes, climate and sustainability is there, but at least half the resources are around CSRD and reporting. The other half of the resources of whatever they might have in sustainability are just trying to figure out what needs to be done. Meanwhile, the rest of the organization is gunning for growth. And that's what made me think, and I think it was just around that time, I think the day before, Rachel Reeves at Davos had made just a side comment around the new runways at Heathrow. And I was thinking, wow, if the UK is expanding, not one, but 5 airports, what are we talking about in terms of demand management? So that's where my thoughts came from initially.
That's a pretty good starting point, Shashank, and I've really enjoyed the exchange online. And I'll just start off by saying I'm speaking today in a personal capacity. I work as Chief Marketing Officer in Future Energy Global, but I'm not talking for the company. I'm just talking as me personally. The original exchange, I guess, we had on LinkedIn was when you'd suggested that demand management was not merely dead, but it was a myth. I think that caused my eyebrows to go up, because if demand management is a myth, then there's an awful lot of airline revenue management departments who I don't know what they do all day, because this is pretty fundamental to how airlines work. We're managing demand through pricing. We see airports managing demand through slot availability. If you want to call up ACL UK and ask them for slots in Heathrow and watch the pitying look they'll give you, that's managing demand as well. So we've got a lot of existing examples of demand management going on in the aviation business. We've got even more examples of that coming on more and more on stream in tourism, where we see Venice introducing a fee. We see if you want to go to Bhutan, you have to pay a daily fee. If you want to go and see the mountain gorillas in Rwanda, you have to pay a fee. These are all examples of demand management. So bringing it back here to aviation, I'm actually not terribly surprised, and I think we're just going to violently agree on this. I'm not terribly surprised to hear a load of airline CEOs saying that they plan to expand. I've had various conversations with airline CSOs and CEOs, and it's perfectly rational for them all to plan to expand, because if they don't expand, their competitors will. So this is a classic tragedy of the commons issue. So, if you sit at a table with a load of airline CEOs and they all say we plan to expand, that, with respect, isn't really front page news, and because the demand management is not the individual airlines delivering that. That has to be some level above it, and we've seen that with various European policymakers, and I think that's probably something we'll get into in a bit more detail now. If we don't manage demand, if we just have unconstrained growth, then unfortunately we're not going to hit our net zero by 2050 target. It's already looking fairly dodgy. I think you'd probably agree. And if we continue to grow on current trajectories, I see no way of reaching that. So that's I suppose my starting point.
So Patrick, I mean, if I can just interject there, I mean, can I just maybe get to sort of to what your definition of demand management is? I mean, is it for fewer people to fly, or is it to sort of to slightly put the brakes on growth, that there's a sort of a slower curve going up? I'm thinking, especially because you mentioned some of the examples you mentioned. I mean, as you'll be aware, the Venice one is not doing a really good job of sort of putting.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's been a very high profile example, but the amount they're charging visitors is very, very small. It doesn't actually change behavior in any way.
Is it €5? I believe.
Yeah, I think it's something like that.
Yeah.
But I guess when we do demand forecasting, for example, for new route cases, we talk about unconstrained demand and constrained demand. So unconstrained is, if there's infinite capacity, how many people are likely to want to travel? And then constrained is we're constraining it based on capacity, based on fare levels or other things. So it's perfectly natural to constrain demand. We can't expect there will be infinite flows. So in that sense, I would say that can be limiting growth, for example, whether by capacity, it can be having an impact from ticket prices, but I don't think it's possible to continue growing in an unconstrained way.
Okay. I mean, Shashank, do you want to respond to that? I mean, what is your position on that point? You're on.
Sorry, I was on mute, of course.
Oh, I didn't imagine I could have made you speechless.
I was dumbfounded, Patrick. Usually it's your quotes that leave me dumbfounded, which I absolutely love. So here's the reality, right? Demand management in the latest European roadmap has anywhere from 2% to 16% of carbon reduction by 2050. That's putting lipstick on a pig. I think that's outright lying, because IATA or ACI or other airports and airlines have no way of showing us how they're going to reduce demand by 16%. They say that, having SAF will increase prices enough. I mean, I know we're going to talk about prices in elasticity shortly, but I don't see how demand is going to reduce by 16% or 2% even by 2050. In fact, we expect demand to double by 2050, and that is 2 to 3% growth every year. There are 29,000 airplanes in the air, over 45,000 in the air by 2050. Most of them flying today's technology. So jet engine, you need fuel, you need SAF. Guess what? If there are airplanes in the air, then airlines have to fill them up to be able to make money, to a point Patrick was making earlier. And we are not even accounting for, we are still talking the developed world or the Western world right now. The moment you go to where the true growth is coming from, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, India, Indonesia, now we're talking. You tell me, where is this reduction in demand going to come from?
Well, just to pick up on your last point, we're not talking about a reduction in demand. We're talking about constraining demand. People still want to travel. We agree, as we said at the beginning, flying is fantastic. We need to be able to ensure that continues in a sustainable way. And doing some comments in reverse order, the developing world, as we all know, the propensity to fly has been historically far, far lower than in developed countries. So it's not for us to engage in some sort of climate colonialism and tell developing countries what they can and cannot do. I'm really just looking in this case at what needs to happen in terms of developed countries showing the way, if you like. In talking about demand management, the most recent industry level report on roadmap to 2050 was probably Destination 2050, published a couple of weeks ago by a number of airline associations. So that's European Regions Airline Association, ACI Europe, Airlines for Europe, and a couple of others. They're forecasting 16% reduction in demand simply coming from the higher prices of SAF. So that's if you like, not some big policy measure. That's simply recognizing we have to have SAF. SAF is more expensive. That's going to have an impact on ticket price. And again, that's a set of industry bodies forecasting that. And you'd mentioned a little while ago, Shashank, Rachel Reeves, the UK Chancellor, talking about airport expansion. And I think the UK is a really good example here, because you probably have seen earlier this week the Climate Change Committee in the UK, which is a body set up under UK climate legislation, produced a report which essentially said we have to limit aviation growth until such time as technology allows us to expand it. So far from let's go out and build lots of runways, their attitude has been we need to actually limit this. So this isn't about being a spoil sport or something. This is about recognizing that whether or not we like it, we have a climate emergency here at the moment, and we need to take some steps to reduce aviation's impact on that. So aviation in the UK, I think this year is 9% of total emissions, and the projection is that out by, I think it's by 2050, it'll be 27% of total emissions, and that isn't really a tenable trajectory, I'd suggest.
Indeed, and that kind of puts paid to this line that we hear a lot of aviation conferences of only 2.5%, which we all know is a very misleading statistic because it hides the fact that for countries like the UK or indeed Ireland, it is far higher.
That's right.
Air travel and able to travel. But picking up that point, Patrick, when you mentioned that, yes, I mean the regulatory body in the UK did say that. But yet at the same time, we have a Labour government which talks big on net zero. It has all sorts of grand, promises, in the very unique position of possibly expanding 5 airports in London at the same time.
Yes.
I mean, where does the kind of the reality of the situation, come into play here?
Well, I know Shashank likes quotes. I recall a quote from Alice Through the Looking Glass where somebody says, I'm able to believe half a dozen impossible things before breakfast. And I can't comment on the consistency of going big on net zero and at the same time expanding runway capacity. So, I'm not going to speak for the UK government. I don't think my ego is that large. But I think that if we look at what the alternatives are, we can either say, okay, there has to be some recognition of aviation's climate impact, and we need to think about how we address that. And that's not going to be the airlines who are doing that themselves. I mean, that's like saying, we have a meeting of the local burglars, and they're all agreeing to voluntarily reduce their number of burglaries. It's actually the police who are going to have to decide that.
Did you just call my roundtable a roundtable of burglars?
No, I didn't at all. I was using an analogy. It's a figure of speech. But I think that, and again, as I mentioned, I've talked to a lot of airline folks, as I know you have, Shashank and Dirk, and what they'll say in private is actually very different to what they'll say in public. And the private conversations are along the lines of, yeah, we really have a problem here, but we don't see a way out of it. I had one conversation with a very senior person who said, what we'd really like is much harder regulation that would hit us all equally, because then at least, we wouldn't be competitively disadvantaged by going out and spending more on sustainability. So the truth of the matter is the individual airlines are being completely rational economic actors. I'm not faulting them for that. But within that system, there has to be some policy input if we want to reduce that unconstrained growth. Maybe we don't want to reduce that unconstrained growth. I mean, I think if we look at the other side of the Atlantic at the moment, anything resembling regulation seems to be out the window in the current US environment. But actually, you probably have to bleep that last word, because I don't think I'm allowed to say environment and US together at the moment. So I think we have to decide, we either let this just grow, and of course it has climate impacts, or we think about how equitably we can manage that growth.
Shashank, how do you respond to that?
I'm in the US right now, and I know, Patrick, what you're talking about. I feel the sentiment. The last 4 weeks here have been nothing short of extraordinary. And yes, don't use the word sustainability, use energy resilience. The coolest word I heard recently was energy dominance. Was not just resilience and energy dominance, is what you go for. And that's still putting lipstick on a pig. It's just doing something same but different, as they say in Thailand, right? Going back to your original point that we need stronger regulations, I had 2 conversations, and also that behind the scenes people are saying different things. One was with Luca Eubank, which was just this week's podcast, in which
it was an interesting listen, by the way, Shashank, and demand management appeared to be far from dead listening to
that. From the policymakers' perspective, yes. Now, it is true that airline lobbyists, airline CEOs are saying something different behind closed doors, and something else publicly for managing their reputation. But at the base of it is the sheer lack of binding policy frameworks. Policy frameworks often guide or advise. They are seldom binding. EU ETS, I think, is binding to some airlines in certain jurisdictions, but that is an exception. We've seen what happened at Schiphol, for example, where they tried to introduce the cap. KLM sued Schiphol and won and managed to, the tap is no longer there. We've seen what happened in the UK, like you mentioned, when the government was cornered with pursuing growth, economic growth versus their sustainability goals. Guess what they chose? They went for growth. And we are still in Europe, which has the willingness and the ability to regulate. If you heard JD Vance talk about taking away all regulation in his recent speech at the AI Summit in Paris, I don't think the US is going to regulate. In fact, they feel they're already over.
You reckon? Yeah. Sure.
Over-regulate. So I don't see governments coming here and playing a legally binding role, giving airlines a fair playing field. What you will have is islands of regulation which impact only those airlines. And then guess what? Those airlines are going to go up in arms saying, you are unfairly impacting me and not others. So for example, Lufthansa may be imposing, I think it's a 70 euro SAF charge on all tickets starting soon, or they're already doing it on all long-haul flights. But guess what? All I have to do is, if I'm flying to Singapore, I'll fly Turkish. They don't do that. They don't need to do that.
And that's very much the Lufthansa and the Air France talking point. You're absolutely right. That's carbon leakage. Hence the reason why the European Commission is looking at applying a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, to air services. So in the same way that if you import steel from, let's say, India to Europe, you basically have to pay an import charge, which is equivalent to what the emissions charges would be if you'd produced it in Europe. What they're looking at now is applying something similar to deal with that level of carbon leakage. So I think that the fact that US policy is applying full reverse thrust at the moment isn't in itself a reason to say, hey, we can't do demand management. Demand management. If you speak to the European Commission, they're still very committed and moving forward with this. As you'll know, and as I think your previous guest mentioned, the Commission is mandated to report next year on whether the implementation of CORSIA is in line with the Paris Agreement 1.5 degree goal. Now, the dogs in the street can tell you that it's not, because CORSIA is delivering pretty much homeopathic levels of emissions reduction. So that would mean that ETS, EU ETS, would be extended to full scope from 2027, all flights out of Europe, including long-haul flights. Of course, we'll have the mother of all transatlantic trade wars at that point, assuming that Europe hasn't been invaded by US forces. So I think, and I in no way minimizing the difficulty of implementing policy, but I don't think that's a reason for us to say, oh, we shouldn't even try. Just to tell you very quickly, a couple of really interesting academic papers that I refer to quite a bit. There's a really interesting paper by Stefan Gösling and his collaborators modeling airline profitability under different growth scenarios. And he modeled this relatively extreme scenario where traffic stays at 2019 levels. It's just capped at 2019 levels. I'm not saying it's practical or desirable, but it's capped. What happens to airline profits? They quadruple, because all of a sudden fares have gone up and airlines are now colossally profitable. I'm not suggesting that's a good thing, but I'm just saying there are different ways of looking at that. And the last thing I'd say, just to what you were mentioning, Shashank, is another really good academic paper that I recommend to everybody is one by Lamb and collaborators called Discourses of Climate Delay. And this is wonderful. This is basically looking at excuses for doing nothing and putting them into a little taxonomy. So, there's 4 categories of excuses. There's, we're not responsible, it's somebody else. What about China? But what about those other guys? But we'll be disadvantaged.
What about shipping?
What about shipping? Exactly. Yeah, you're getting the hang of this. This is great. The other one is the other one is, yeah, we can fix all this. Let's do this by recycling our coffee cups. In other words, the solutions are this is back to what we've talked about, greenwashing all along, because there are solutions, but they're not addressing the big problem. Another way of doing it is to say, oh, but if we have this change, then there's going to be downsides. Then working families can't afford to travel. This is anti-democratic. And we've heard that one as well. And then the last one is to say, well, there's no point in doing anything. The die is cast, so hey, let's just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we fry. So, there are different ways of looking at this, but I prefer not to give up hope that it is possible to do something.
So what about shipping? Actually, CMAP is something that Michael O'Leary
yes.
And that actually doesn't work very well, because what about
No.
shipping? The IMO is actually doing quite a lot. And
Yes,
you
they
could-
are. They absolutely are, and they are recognizing the responsibility for international emissions, and they're actually going further than aviation on this. Exactly.
Absolutely.
They're going much further.
Yes,
Yeah.
but just sort of to move the topic on a little bit. I mean, Shashank, one of the most striking things you said in your news that Patrick picked up upon was this idea of not the green premium but the gilt premium. And I wonder if we could just talk about that. So Shashank, why don't you just explain to us what you meant by that, and then give Patrick a chance to respond.
Sure. Now, before I do that, I'm going to jump in and say a lot of people have joined on LinkedIn Live.
Cool.
LinkedIn Live has a time limit. So we're going to have to stop the LinkedIn Live, but this episode will be released on Sustainability in the Air on the 6th of March. So make sure you're subscribed and you don't miss, because we're going to be discussing gilt premium, price elasticity of demand. We're going to have closing comments, and hopefully we'll actually butt heads on this, right, Patrick? And not just agree on everything.
Well, we'll see how we go. But I think we agree on a lot of things, but I think it will be interesting to just look at some of the different approaches that are possible.
Exactly. So I'm going to just pause LinkedIn here. Thanks for everyone for joining us live on LinkedIn. This will be out on March 6th. So check out the podcast platforms. Thank you, Patrick and Dirk as well.
All right.
Thank
Shashank,
you.
let's talk about the gilt premium.
Yes. Now give me 1 second.
Keep Riverside open while your recording uploads. I'm just going to say okay to that.